I'm your co-host, Jack.
And I'm the other co-host, Theo.
And welcome to Radio Free New England. For our second episode, we'll be talking about the NEIC's platform and goals. It's just the two of us today, and Theo will be answering some of the common questions we've seen about how the NEIC operates and what its goals are. So off the bat, we have to cover, what's the NEIC's platform?
I mean, it's on the website. I'll go over it really quick, though, for folks, listeners at home or whatever, as it were. We've got 7 major points that we work towards besides just generally, autonomy or independence or secession or whatever the word you want to use. Our main principle, and this really is the big one, is localized government. On a really fundamental level, democracies work better the smaller they are. They work better the more people are able to be in touch with the issues they're voting on, etc., etc. It's become very, very clear that the U.S. federal government is too big. We're seeing that happen right now. We're seeing how, people on the other side of the country are making decisions for the other side of the country, and all back and forth like that. These people with very different sort of moral frameworks and cultural ideals and everything. And it's just not functional. It means you get legislative deadlock. It means you get people pushing really hard for, when they're in power, they want to be the ones making all the decisions. Then the moment they're out of power, they're really pissed off that the other people want to make decisions, and so on and so forth. That means, smaller and less powerful national government, even once, we're independent and stuff like that. More powers for states and municipalities, especially local stuff, cities, towns. People in different places have different needs, and it's a pretty fundamental precept of ours that smaller and more local governments are better equipped to serve those needs. Going down the list otherwise, neutrality, non-interventionism, it's just so obvious how much of a waste of taxpayer money and how much of a waste of American lives all of our interventions have been, but not even that, just on a really basic level, America's done a lot of horrible stuff to a lot of other countries and a lot of other people across the world, justified by our own interests, or, when they can't even manage that, just doing it for oil, and military-industrial complex companies. And that's not, that's not a principle of ours. We're trying to step away from this American empire. Otherwise, the surveillance state. Obviously, that's one of the biggest concerns that a lot of people have. Is one of the ways that the federal government overreaches the most is rejecting people's right to privacy. Accountability in governance, not only in terms of transparency around elected officials and interference in elections and everything like that, but in more accountability about tax dollars, putting them where they need to be, having people pay for what they need to pay. We are really hard on being a Big Ten organization. New England has a lot of political diversity and a lot of bipartisan cooperation in a way that a lot of the rest of the country doesn't. And we want to make that real. We want to, carry those principles. We don't, we're not blue separatists. Our founder, we were founded during Obama's presidency. A lot of our membership are centrists and moderates, and we've got some conservatives, we've got some libertarians. One of the really important things is we're not here to push our politics. We're just here to let people actually come to their own decisions, to make sure that New England is the laws and the rules and the governments of New England are voted for by New Englanders and not by people who don't live here and don't understand what we're about. And in congruence with that, we believe in, a lot of general sort of basic, Western democratic principles: human rights, liberty, environmental protection, transparency, respect for individuals as equal, respect for people being the originator for the power of government, and so on and so forth. And lastly, it would be a pretty big hypocrites if we didn't recognize the right to self-determination of other people too. We absolutely recognize that the indigenous populations of all of America, but that includes New England, have been conquered, have been dispossessed of their lands, and we absolutely are committed to working with Native people if they're willing to work with us to try to pass forward for addressing the harm inflicted, using models like New Zealand for ideas of how to sometimes address this sort of things, or Aotearoa, as it's hopefully going to be more officially called in the coming years. Um, but that's just like a bunch of principles that doesn't really talk about actually like what things are going to look like and what we're doing.
What it's gonna be,
Yeah.
But it does seem to mainly convey the point of expanding options for individuals to interact with their government and have input.
Yeah, we want to bring power to the people.
So, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, on a basic level, this organization isn't interested in changing New England. We're not interested in making it into something it isn't. We just want to give it its own voice. Um, that being said, I think you can make some reasonable extrapolations about what New Englanders are likely to use their new voice to vote for and to favor. I think you can reasonably expect greater democratizations, like more use of ballot measures and referendums, especially because it'll be smaller governments. Maine is leading the nation with ranked choice voting, and we expect that to increase. A lot of the criticisms of ranked choice voting are that it requires it's more complicated. It requires a better educated populace. New England is one of the best educated populaces in the world. Other things, getting money out of politics. That's huge. A lot of people support it, and if we can step away from some of the systems that allow for such, constant corruption in the U.S. federal system, it's going to be a lot easier to do something like that. I've seen people talk about complete political reorganizations, talk about having a parliamentary system with coalition party stuff. I'm not saying that's infeasible. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I have to say it's probably unlikely that people are going to be super interested in that, at least in the short term, unless things change a lot.
It seems so fundamentally different.
Yeah, people are just, they're going to be wanting to stick with what's comfortable to them. And so we're never going to go up on stage and say, when we make a Republic of New England or whatever it ends up being called, it has to be a parliamentary system. That's a kind of arrogance that we're not about. We're not doing that. That isn't to say that won't happen, but, in all honesty, it's probably just going to be the, the U.S. federal system with a lot of really important tweaks, but no fundamental reformatting. Other things, gun control. People talk about that.
As it would be relevant.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's one of the hot button topics in America today. A lot of people are single issue voters on that, one way or the other. 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even, if New England was suddenly independent, there probably would have been a lot of gun restrictions. But we're watching right now, with everything that the federal government's been doing, we're watching a lot of liberals suddenly being a little more, reevaluating their ideas about the necessity of, or maybe the unnecessity of access to firearms. So we'll see. I think what's most reasonable to expect is, a greater federalization of gun rights, or a continuation of the current state. I mean, I can't imagine New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont are going to be, just going to happily give up all their guns if Massachusetts votes for it. But at the same time, I'm not imagining that a lot of Massachusetts will be comfortable loosening a lot of their gun laws, and Connecticut and Rhode Island will be comfortable loosening a lot of their gun laws. So I think the best thing we can hope for is making it less of a federal issue, and giving more power to states and other smaller political divisions to make that decision.
Right, and that's obviously that's important because martial law has been somewhat threatened by the administration and by proponents of the administration, but it also relates to the question of how, what greater action would be involved with any sort of secession, and it always seems to bring up the idea of gun rights, but other people that are minding secession talk more of economic concerns as opposed to the physical here and now of it all.
Yeah, I mean, on a basic level, yeah, sure. It's, any kind of statecraft, any kind of politics is just a sort of a disambiguation of violence, right? Like, I don't know if at basic level, like taxes, right? Like, like governments levying taxes are, you're going to give us our money, or if you don't give us your money, eventually, if you keep refusing to give us your money, we're going to send guys with guns after you, on a basic level. Like, that's how it works. And so, like, obviously, yes, at the end of the day, governance is about force, it's about violence. But I mean, and we can talk about this more later, but the NEIC we're not interested in using violence. I mean, like, even if there ends up being some kind of American, like, balkanization or civil war, like, we don't want that to happen. That's the worst possible outcome. A peaceful separation is a lot more ideal, and that means, yeah, like, the actual things that we got to worry about are economic concerns. The interesting fact that I'm sure gets thrown around a lot if you've been following New England independence ideas is, on a basic level, more federal tax dollars leave our states than come back. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's like a couple dollars leave for every dollar that comes back. And that doesn't feel good. Because on a basic level, like, what this is.
And it's been such a contentious issue in light of the administration trying to levy that notion against us in means of enforcement. So a lot of people have been talking about stopping federal tax dollars from leaving the state.
Yeah, there is that. So yeah, I see people talking about this a lot in NEIC spaces and other sort of independent spaces, and even like people who aren't even aware that they're being secessionist. Like, let's make it very clear: if a state were to do anything, and by any means hold hostage federal tax dollars, that's essentially a declaration of secession in and of itself. But that's not like, that is something that will happen eventually, absolutely. The fact that the administration is withholding federal tax support to states as a form of weaponization of the federal government against political opposition is one of the big reasons why we've been seeing a big swell of support for our movement and movements like ours. But any response in kind is, on a basic level, like I said, like if you refuse to pay taxes and you keep refusing when the federal government tells you to, eventually they send the people with guns after you. And so is it a thing that'll happen eventually? Yes. Is it a thing that's going to happen now or as some kind of intermediary step before we actually, like, declare secession or anything like that? No, that's absurd and not really practical.
Right. And I think that's an important thing to put out there.
Yeah, but I don't know. In terms of other economic stuff, I think it's likely to predict that an independent New England would turn towards more European economic models. We do have a lot more ties to Europe. We have a lot of, there's a lot more people in New England than most other regions in the U.S. that are comfortable with, like, sort of like Scandinavian model social democracy. Exactly how that'll turn out, obviously, I can't tell you that, and nobody can tell you that. But, probably, we're going to see European connections also in terms of trade, obviously it'll be good to bolster our self-sufficiency, but we'll need to import food at a basic, on a fundamental level. And trade with Canada, obviously, too, assuming Canada isn't joining us as an independence movement from the U.S. federal government. Maybe China? That's a contentious question, and I don't want to be the person to make that decision. I want that to be up to the voting public. Otherwise, other economic things, questions of currency. I see people talk about currency a lot. That's not a crucial concern. Like, there's this local currency in Western Mass and, like, in one town in New York, if I recall correctly. That's called Berkshires. That might expand, or we might end up using a New England dollar, or we might just end up using euros or Canadian dollars. Like, that's a very distant concern, and that's not exactly going to be the difference between success and failure for an independent New England.
Right.
Yeah, and then I don't know. Otherwise, like, what will New England's an independent New England's culture look like? I don't know. I mean, it's probably not going to change much immediately, but probably over time, greater connections with Canada and Europe, and separation from like American, especially like American, like Midwest and Southeast culture, which like sometimes has its impacts. Probably there will be some separation there. There will be a sort of an increase in, I guess nationalism is the right word. But how that'll present itself, what it'll result as, I again, I can't tell you exactly. It's the possibilities are.
I think culture is one of those things that's so hard to properly describe because it's something that you're entrenched
Yeah,
in
yeah.
without even realizing.
There's so many little
So,
things. I was reading a thing the other day about how like CIA agents have to be trained to like stand differently when they're waiting, because Americans do this thing where Americans lean against things and like Europeans don't. Like when you're like waiting for something and you lean against something, like that's an American cultural artifact, you know? And so all these tiny little things, like, yeah, I mean, a lot of our culture is just broader American culture. But given time to find ourselves and given time to make our own choices, that's going to change. But how is it going to change exactly? That's,
it's
there's no
hard
way
to
to
say.
predict that. Yeah.
But in any case, it sounds like there are certain things that would happen. The question is kind of, what are those things? How would we get there to that ideal state?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is the biggest question. A lot of people, they show up in our town halls, they show up in our, on our subreddits and in the Discord asking about stuff. And one of the most common questions is like, okay, like I'm on board with this. I like this idea. How are we going to make it happen? What's the process? Do you have a plan? And I mean, the basic answer is yes, we do have a plan. But the more complicated answer is that just as it's, just as it's hard to predict exactly how things are going to look, 10, 15 years from now, it's very challenging to know exactly what strategies we'll be needing to doing in the. It's challenging to know exactly what strategies we'll be needing to do in the future. I mean, obviously, there's legal steps that need to be taken. There's economic steps that need to be taken. There's going to be questions of like military use and enforcement. What do we do about federal lands that are, technically federal property? How do we convince the rest of the union to let us go? All that stuff. On a basic level, though, what you need first, right, before any of this, is we need New Englanders to know that this is an option. We need New Englanders to not only know that this is an option, but that this is something that could happen, that this isn't just a pipe dream. We need to, so many times I've talked to people across New England about this idea, and they've been like, oh, yeah, that would be really cool. They've just never realized that there's any kind of cohesive organizations and this movement to actually make it happen. It's very, very rare that I've heard someone actually oppose the idea of it. And so that means just getting our name out there. Not just our name, there are other organizations too, YNP, NEIM, they're doing all of this. It's this big movement, and it's only going to get bigger when people just see our names around, see New England flags, getting displayed by businesses and everything like that. But I mean, sure, let's talk about, once we get that critical mass of support, what do we do then?
Right, like what happens next in like legislature and enforcement?
Yeah, and I mean, obvious thing is ballot questions, stuff like that. I mean, California right now, there's a ballot question on. I mean, it's sort of a declaration of. I mean, it's not really a proper declaration of independence. It's more of like we would like to secede, sort of a vote of no confidence in the federal government. California regularly polls at 30+% support for secession, so we're watching that with interest. I'd love to get a good sense of where the numbers are at now. But that ballot question, that California ballot question, but anyone that we run here also, those aren't going to be binding. We can't just like vote to secede and then it's like, oh, I guess we've seceded. Like, it's a lot more complicated than that. But what they can do is they can ascertain majority opinion, right? And so like the one of the most important steps, actually, even though it doesn't do anything in and of itself, but one of the most important steps to making something like this happen is to get a ballot question in every New England state asking whether people would like to secede as New England. And if all of those can break 50%, or if we can get even higher, 60, 65%, it's a very clear sign to the world, to the federal government, that this is something that is a genuine potential thing that could happen. This is a genuine, threat to the sort of the cohesion of the federal government. And at a bare minimum, even if they don't let us secede, they're probably going to at least wise up their act a little bit. Other things, taxes, we talked about this already, but yeah, like rerouting federal taxes would be essentially a declaration of secession on their own. Not exactly a move that you do early in the game. There has been some attempts in other states to institute this like state escrow where the state collects the federal taxes and then gives it to the government. We might be able to do that. I don't believe any of those have ever been passed, but it could happen. But actually,
it's one of the solutions most talked about.
Yeah. Like once people actually start talking about this seriously, that's something that I've seen. And like I'm not opposed to that. I think that could be cool. But actually, then withholding that escrow to the government would be, that's treason basically. Not exactly the first thing to do. And I guess actually, the question of like treason, like what's the deal? Like regarding constitutionality, right? It's a more complicated question than simply being illegal or impossible or treasonous or whatever. The prohibition on secession is a Supreme Court decision. It's not baked into the Constitution anywhere specifically, which means, especially with the current Supreme Court, has showed a very strong willingness to to roll back judicial precedents, even pretty old precedents. But also, like, on a fundamental level, like, in 10 years, who knows if there'll even be a Supreme Court still. They've been completely ignored at this point multiple times, and if their power just completely goes away, or they just become, like, the final sort of appeals court for federal cases and nothing more, you know...
and I think that kind of that developing change in the relation between the branches of the federal government as it stands is kind of a central focus of
absolutely.
why people are thinking about this now in particular.
Yeah.
And because of the way that it's been playing out, it seems as though some people that the courts are in danger and that the only branch of the government that has much power is the executive, responsible for military and enforcement, and people are worried about
that. A lot of people are worried, and I don't think it's unreasonable to be worried. I think, as it pertains to this organization and this movement, our goal is to do it with their assent, with the U.S. federal government being to some degree willing to let us go without use of force. That being said, we can't guarantee this perfect world. It may be the case that they end up using force. That would be long and bloody and very bad for both of our economies. It would be very likely that, especially as the American federal government loses a lot of its standing internationally, we'd probably be able to draw upon foreign allies, leveraging PR and stuff like that. But that is worst case scenario. And the NEIC absolutely holds that the worst possible thing that New England could do is to fire the first shot in that kind of conflict. That's not that's not part of our goals. That's not part of our strategy, and we strongly suggest that other similar organizations hold that same principle.
Then, if we're depending on government assent, would the current administration just let us go?
I think it's not as impossible as some people think. I remember back in, I think, like 2023, 2024, like Marjorie Taylor Greene was like kind of a figurehead of this national divorce campaign. Basically, the idea is like, all the blue states and the red states just separate themselves. I'm not like completely on board with that because I mean, like on a basic level, like, Michigan and Minnesota have a lot more to do with like, Ohio than we do, I mean, I guess, I mean, it wouldn't be the end of the world if there was some like union of blue states, but that would just be weird politically. But I mean, on a basic level, what it does do though is it shows that there is a will among these like MAGA leadership that like they may be interested in that, especially if Trump and MAGA lose or look like they're going to be losing a lot of power to like sort of like unionist like Democrats and like moderate Republicans and stuff. We might see something like that happen. We could also see, I mean, the other big backers for Trump are like Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel and like a number of these like neo-rationalist, neo-reactionary folks, and they also want to dismantle the federal government. They want to separate the U.S. into dozens of little tiny polities. I don't think they'd be terribly opposed to the idea of maybe not working with us. I don't really want to work with them either, but at least voting for the same resolutions. Um, all of this comes to say, like, I think it is more likely than people tend to think that the current administration will just let us go. But that's not a guarantee, obviously. Um, and like back in 2014, we none of this was on the radar, right? The U.S. was flawed, and our founders and our founder and like the first early members, they were very cogent. They were very, you know, they looked at things and they saw that it's only going to be downhill from there, and they did a hell of a job in making that kind of conclusion. Um, but even back then, like they were conceptualizing a government in federal power that respects rule of law, right? That respects democracy. And they were hoping that, if New England comes together with strong support for these ballot questions and gets a lot of people into state and maybe even federal legislatures who are in favor of New England secession, that the federal government would let us go on sort of ethical grounds. But it's looking more and more like actually it's going to be practical, right? These very like far conservatives who are like in the Heritage Foundation also who are running the government might be happy to let us go just so that there's a few less blue states in the union so that they can consolidate their power. And exactly how things go, I mean, I've said this before, but there's a lot of uncertainty. Like the reason why we don't have like a here's our 10-step plan for making New England secede is because like it's very, very challenging to say exactly how the federal government's going to react with the current state of things. If the government was committed to following rule of law and following the Constitution and everything, like, yeah, okay, sure. But now, who knows? Things aren't exactly trustworthy like that anymore.
Right. And with the idea of a national divorce and all that uncertainty, people wonder if either a national divorce or a New England secession were to occur, what would that mean economically? We already addressed currency and the tax withholding, but there's more to it than that.
Preparing for this kind of very significant political reorganization will require a lot of economic reorganization too. Finding new trade ties, reorganizing things internally about how we conduct trade and economic control within New England, everything like that. Especially, especially if you don't want the economy to collapse out of nowhere, this has to be a process that we start in advance. We work with unions and companies and other, economic organizations, banks, working with New England separatist groups to make this happen. But I think on a basic level, like as much as yes, we should be working on that, and like I've been pushing for that a little bit, and NEIC has some stuff that we're working towards adjacent to that, and other organizations have been definitely a lot more focused on that, and all power to them. On a basic level, like especially big corporations and banks and stuff like that, they're not going to be interested in risking something on this without it being clear that there's a lot of public support. And so it's, I mean, the sort of the question I'm sure that's on your minds, right, is what does all this mean, right? What is, like, all of this uncertainty, all these questions, and the few answers that I've been able to give. What that means strategically is it's a focus on marketing. It's a focus on communications, getting our word out, getting our name out, get people to realize this is possible, get them involved in helping to spread the word. And once we hit that critical mass of support, whatever that is, I mean, there's, depending on the sort of the framework you're working with, it could be anything from 3.5% of the population to 66%. But once we hit, there will be a threshold at which organizations are going to start sort of independently seeing all this thing, other groups, other political groups, like, like if the New England Democratic Party, like oh my God, what's the word? Chapters, start just independently going like, oh wow, there's a lot of support for secession. Maybe we should run like secessionist candidates. Like, that's our job done. The NEIC doesn't need to exist anymore. It's because we've done the really big thing. We've done that big struggle of getting everybody on board. That's why we have so much of a focus on communications work. We've got, I mean, besides this podcast, we've got a blog, we've got poster and sticker campaigns. We show up at protests and other events, get the word out, get our name out. And I mean, frankly, like, for you, the listener, as it were, this is the easiest job you could have too. Just talk to people, tell them about this. And that's 80% of the work. That's 80% of what we're doing anyway. You don't have, I mean, like, we'd love to have you as a volunteer if you want to help, get specifically involved, work on specific projects, help us with art or volunteering at charities or whatever it is. But if you don't have time for that, which I recognize people do, just spread the word. Maybe buy some merch, get a New England flag on your water bottle. That's always good. Good conversation starter. But that's the big idea.
Right. The idea of seeking to improve the democracy of New England by expanding people's awareness of what's possible or what might be pursuable.
Absolutely. Yeah, so end of I mean, overview. We talked about the platform, right? We talked about our big 7 points, but those aren't really like, I mean, those are important, but those aren't usually what people are asking us about because they can just go to the website, right? We talked about what New England's probably going to look like given assumptions about how New Englanders tend to vote at the moment. What we talked about, assumptions about what New Englanders are like to vote for, what kind of things we are likely to see in terms of political processes, economic reorganizations, cultural changes, if any. We talked about our strategy, about how, there's a lot of steps to make this sort of thing happen, to even if we're not going, even if we're not going to completely reach secession, doing a lot of these intermediary things like developing regional autonomy and self-sufficiency and things like that. I mean, that can never go wrong. Just look at the Quiet Revolution in Quebec back in the I think in the 1970s and 80s, I believe. That was revolutionary. It completely revitalized their economy. And that's the same stuff we're advocating for. We just have, we've got the broader goal as well. And we talked about the uncertainty and our reasoning for being primarily focused on marketing and PR work as we develop our organization, as we develop this movement as a whole, as we spread the word. That, I think, will be all for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we're glad you, hope you enjoyed.
We're with the New England Independence Campaign, and if you'd like to get involved and donate your time or money to making New England free again, check out our website, newenglandindependence.org, or any of our social media accounts on the website or in the description.